The wedding auction was in full swing when Ethan Boone, wild-eyed and weathered from 10 years of mountain exile, burst through the church doors. His boots thundered against wooden floors as he strode past shocked townspeople toward the altar where Lila Wynne stood trembling in a borrowed dress, about to be sold to the highest bidder. Without warning, he grabbed her face, kissed her deeply, and growled to the stunned preacher, "Marry us, now!" The banker's furious roar echoed through Cedar Falls, but Ethan's gold had already hit the table. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Stick around to see how a forced kiss became a legendary love story that shook the Wild West to its core. Drop a comment about where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this tale has traveled. The morning mist clung to the pine-covered slopes like a shroud as Ethan Boone made his way down the mountain path for the first time in 3 years. His leather boots, worn thin from a decade of walking the same rocky trails, found their footing with practiced ease despite the treacherous descent. The rifle slung across his back had become as much a part of him as his own shadow, and the knife at his belt caught the early spring sunlight filtering through the canopy above. 10 years. 10 long years since he'd been branded a killer and driven from Cedar Falls into these unforgiving peaks. 10 years since that night when Samuel Kellerman had come for him with murder in his heart, and Ethan had done what any man would do, defended himself. But self-defense meant nothing when the dead man's brother owned half the town and could buy any verdict he wanted. "Should have stayed up there," Ethan muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse. Days could pass without him speaking a single word aloud, and when he did, it was usually to the ravens that frequented his cabin or the elk that grazed in the meadow below his ridge. Nothing good ever came from going back to Cedar Falls. But his flour was gone, his coffee, nothing but memories, and the last of his ammunition spent on a grizzly that had gotten too curious about his smokehouse last month. A man could live off the land for only so long before civilization's conveniences became necessities. Besides, 3 years had passed since his last trip down. Maybe folks had forgotten. Maybe they'd moved on. The trail widened as he descended, joining the main road that wound through the valley toward town. He could see smoke rising from chimneys in the distance, hear the faint sound of hammering from the lumber mill. Cedar Falls had grown in his absence, new buildings sprouted where forest had once stood, and the road showed marks of heavier traffic than he remembered. As he approached the outskirts, Ethan pulled his wide-brimmed hat lower over his eyes and hunched his shoulders forward. The beard he'd grown thick and wild would help disguise him, as would the sun-weathered skin and the new lines etched around his eyes. Mountain living had changed him, carved away the soft edges of youth, and left something harder, more elemental in its place. The general store sat on Main Street, its familiar facade unchanged despite the years. Ethan tied his pack mule to the post outside and was reaching for the door when he heard it, a woman's voice, high and desperate, carrying over the usual morning bustle. "Please, Father, there must be another way." Ethan froze his hand on the door handle. Through the window, he could see a crowd gathering near the church at the end of the street. Curiosity warred with caution, but the anguish in that voice pulled at something deep in his chest. Against his better judgment, he found himself walking toward the commotion. The church steps were crowded with townspeople, all craning their necks to see what was happening at the entrance. Ethan kept to the edges, using his height to peer over the shorter folks in front of him. What he saw made his blood run cold. A young woman stood on the church steps, her auburn hair gleaming in the morning sun. She wore a white dress, a wedding dress he realized, but her face was pale with fear rather than joy. Beside her, a portly man in an expensive suit gripped her arm with possessive force, but it was the man standing before them with a ledger in his hand that made Ethan's jaw clench. Cyrus Hammond, the banker who'd foreclosed on half the valley's farms during the last drought. The man who'd grown fat on others' misfortunes and dressed his greed in the language of business necessity. "The terms are quite clear, Miss Wynne," Hammond was saying, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who knew he'd already won. "Your father's debts amount to $3,000. Since his unfortunate passing last month, that debt falls to you. You can either marry Mr. Morrison here, who has generously agreed to assume the debt as your dowry, or you can watch as I claim everything, the house, the land, even your mother's jewelry." The woman Lila Wynne Hammond had called her raised her chin despite her obvious fear. "My father would never have borrowed so much. Those papers must be—" "Are you calling me a liar, Miss Wynne?" Hammond's voice turned sharp as a blade. I have the documents right here signed in your father's own hand. Unless you can produce $3,000 in the next... He pulled out his pocket watch with theatrical flair. 10 minutes, the wedding proceeds. Ethan studied the man beside Lila Morrison. He had to be pushing 60 with graying whiskers and the soft look of a man who'd never done an honest day's work. His thick fingers dug into Lila's arm as she tried to pull away, and the hungry way he looked at her made Ethan's skin crawl. "This ain't right," muttered someone near Ethan. "Tom Wynn was a good man. Never borrowed a cent in his life." "Hush," another replied. "You want Hammond coming after you next." The crowd's reluctant acceptance of this injustice stirred something in Ethan that he'd thought long dead, a sense of righteous anger that had nothing to do with his own survival. He'd spent 10 years learning to mind his own business, to keep his head down and his problems to himself. But watching this young woman being sold like cattle to pay a debt that likely never existed. "5 minutes, Miss Wynn," Hammond announced. "Shall we proceed inside?" Morrison's grip tightened, and he began steering Lila toward the church entrance. Her eyes darted wildly around the crowd, searching for help that wouldn't come. For just a moment, her gaze met Ethan's, and he saw not just fear, but a fierce determination not to break, not to give these vultures the satisfaction of seeing her cry. That look decided it. Ethan pushed through the crowd, ignoring the gasps of recognition from those who remembered his face despite the years and the beard. His boots rang against the church steps as he climbed them 2 at a time. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying the authority of the mountains of solitude that had taught him to be comfortable with consequences. Hammond turned, his eyes narrowing. Morrison's face flushed red with indignation, but Ethan's attention was entirely on Lila, whose eyes had widened with a mixture of hope and confusion. "This is a private matter," Hammond began, but Ethan cut him off. "Nothing private about a public auction," Ethan said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with gold. The coins clinked as he set it on Hammond's ledger. $3,000, you said." The crowd murmured with excitement. Hammond's face went through several expressions, surprise, calculation, and finally a cold fury. "Mr. Boone, I thought you understood you weren't welcome in Cedar Falls." "Money's still good, ain't it?" Ethan kept his voice level, though his hand instinctively moved closer to his knife. "Or does your bank discriminate against paying customers?" Morrison sputtered. "Now see here, we had an arrangement. You had nothing but a man's greed and a woman's desperation," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The lady's debts are paid. Release her." "You can't just..." Morrison started, but Ethan moved faster than anyone expected. In one fluid motion, he stepped between Morrison and Lila, forcing the older man to release her arm or be knocked backward. "The debt is paid," Ethan repeated, looking directly at Hammond. "Unless you're saying your bank won't honor gold." Hammond's jaw worked silently for a moment. The crowd pressed closer, sensing the tension. Finally, he snatched up the pouch, weighing it in his hand. This appears sufficient. But Miss Wynn, you understand what you're doing. This man is free to leave," Ethan suggested. "Come on, miss, let's get you out of that dress." Several people gasped at the impropriety of the statement, but Ethan was already guiding Lila down the steps, his hand gentle but firm on her elbow. She moved as if in a daze, allowing him to lead her away from the church, away from Morrison's furious shouts and Hammond's cold stare. They'd made it halfway down Main Street when she finally found her voice. I don't understand. Who are you?" "Why would you—" "Name's Ethan Boone," he said, continuing to walk at a steady pace. "And I did it because what they were doing wasn't right. Simple as that." "But $3,000? I can't possibly repay—" "Didn't ask you to." She stopped walking, forcing him to stop as well. "People don't just give away $3,000 to strangers." Ethan looked at her, then really looked at her. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her green eyes, the grief that shadowed her features. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with a strength in her jaw that suggested she'd faced hardship before. "Your father," he said slowly. "Tom Wynn. He ran the feed store, didn't he?" She nodded, confusion evident on her face. "Years back, before I left town, I was just passing through. Dead broke, middle of winter. Your father gave me a job cleaning stables, paid me fair, and never asked questions about where I came from, Even invited me to Sunday dinner with your family. Ethan's voice softened at the memory. You were just a girl then, maybe 15. You probably don't remember. Lila's eyes widened slightly. The drifter who helped with the horses. You're the one who gentled Mr. Morrison's stallion, the one everyone said couldn't be broke. Same Morrison. She nodded, a bitter smile touching her lips. He never forgave you for making him look foolish. Said he'd have done it himself if you hadn't interfered. Man's grudge runs deep, seems like. Ethan glanced back toward the church where Morrison was engaged in animated conversation with Hammond. Look, Miss Wynne, I've got business at the general store. After that, I'm heading back up the mountain. You're welcome to shelter at my cabin until you figure out your next move. It ain't much, but it's safe, and those two won't follow you there. Mr. Boone, I couldn't possibly. You could and you should, he interrupted. Unless you've got somewhere else to go, family somewhere. Her silence was answer enough. My mother passed 2 winters ago, she finally said. And now, Father, the house will go to Hammond anyway. He holds the real deed, not the inflated one he was using to justify the marriage. Then you've got nothing keeping you here, Ethan said practically. Come with me, stay until you're ready to move on. No obligations, no expectations, just a roof and some time to breathe. She studied his face, searching for deception, for hidden motives. People will talk. A woman going to live with a man in the mountains? People always talk. Question is whether you care what they say. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted behind them. Morrison was striding down the street, his face purple with rage, Hammond following at a more measured pace. This isn't over, Boone, Morrison shouted. You think you can just waltz in here and steal what's mine? The lady was never yours, Ethan replied calmly, though his hand moved to rest on his knife handle. And I'd think real careful about your next words, Morrison. I've been polite so far, but that can change. Morrison stopped several feet away, perhaps remembering the stories about what Ethan had done to Samuel Kellerman. Hammond, tell him, the arrangement was legal. The debt has been paid, Hammond said coldly. However, Mr. Boone, you should know that your presence here violates the terms of your exile. I'll give you 1 hour to conclude your business and leave Cedar Falls. If you're not gone by then, I'll have Sheriff Watson arrest you. Sheriff Watson, Ethan mused. That would be Jim Watson, the one whose mortgage you hold. Hammond's eyes narrowed dangerously. 1 hour, Boone. Ethan touched the brim of his hat mockingly. More than enough time. Miss Wynne, you coming? She looked between the 3 men, then at the gathering crowd of townspeople who watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. Finally, she straightened her spine and lifted her chin in that defiant gesture Ethan was already beginning to recognize. Yes, she said clearly. I'm coming. The walk to the general store felt like a procession. People lined the streets, whispering behind their hands, some with sympathy, others with scandal in their eyes. Lila kept her head high, though Ethan could feel the tremor in her arm where it rested against his. Inside the store, old Henry Brennan's eyes widened when he saw them. Ethan Boone. Lord above, I never thought. And Miss Lila. Need supplies. Henry? Ethan said, pulling out a list he'd written weeks ago. Everything on here, quick as you can. Henry scanned the list, his eyebrows rising. This is enough for 2 people for several months. That a problem? No, no problem at all. Henry began gathering items, his movements efficient despite his age. As he worked, he kept glancing at Lila in her wedding dress. Miss Lila, I'm real sorry about your father. He was a good man. Thank you, Mr. Brennan, she said softly. That debt Hammond claimed, Henry continued, lowering his voice. Tom never borrowed no $3,000. I'd stake my store on it. Doesn't matter now, Ethan said. It's paid. Henry paused in his packing. You know Hammond won't let this go. He had plans for Miss Lila and Morrison, big plans involving land rights and water access. Then he'll have to make new plans. As Henry finished packing the supplies into canvas sacks, the store door burst open. A young boy, maybe 12, ran in breathless. Mr. Boone, sheriff's coming with deputies. They're saying you violated exile, that you threatened Mr. Morrison. Ethan cursed under his breath. How far? 2 streets over, moving fast. Henry, these supplies ready. Just about there. Henry pushed the last sack across the counter. Ethan threw more gold coins on the counter, then began loading the sacks onto his shoulders. "Miss Wynne, can you carry one of these?" She grabbed a sack without hesitation, hefting it despite the wedding dress. "Where's your mule?" "Out front, no wait." Ethan moved to the window. Sure enough, he could see Watson and 3 deputies approaching, their hands resting on their gun butts. "Back door, Henry." The old man was already moving. "Through the storeroom. Opens onto the alley. Your mule?" "I'll get him, the boy volunteered. "Bring him around back." Ethan pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "Fast as you can, son." They moved through the cluttered storeroom, Lila struggling with her dress, catching on boxes and barrels. Without thinking, Ethan pulled out his knife and sliced the train clean off, leaving her with a more manageable skirt length. "That was my mother's dress," she said, though without reproach. "She'd rather see you free than prettied up for Morrison," Ethan replied. The alley was narrow and muddy from recent rain. They could hear Sheriff Watson's voice from inside the store demanding to know where they'd gone. The boy appeared with the mule just as Henry's voice rose in protest about warrant requirements. Ethan threw the supplies over the mule's back with practiced efficiency, then turned to Lila. "Can you ride?" "Yes, but heel." Without ceremony, he lifted her onto the mule's back. "Hold tight. This might get rough." He grabbed the mule's lead and started down the alley at a quick pace. Behind them, shouts erupted as the sheriff discovered their escape route. Ethan broke into a run, the mule trotting alongside Lila, gripping its mane with white knuckles. They burst out of the alley onto the side street that led toward the mountain trail. A few early risers stared in shock at the sight of them, the exiled killer, the bride in her torn dress, fleeing like bandits in a dime novel. "Boone, stop in the name of the law!" Watson's voice carried over the morning air, but Ethan didn't slow. The trail was just ahead, winding up into the tree line. Once they reached the forest, pursuit would become much harder. A gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet whining past Ethan's ear. Lila gasped, ducking low over the mule's neck. "Warning shot," Ethan said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "They won't follow us far." They plunged into the trees, the sudden darkness of the forest canopy a welcome relief. Ethan knew these trails like the lines on his own hands, every shortcut, every false path, every hidden glen where a man could disappear. He led them off the main trail, almost immediately following a deer path that wound through thick undergrowth. After 20 minutes of hard travel, he finally slowed, listening for sounds of pursuit. Nothing but birds and wind in the pines. "We're clear," he said, helping Lila down from the mule. She was shaking, whether from fear or adrenaline he couldn't tell. "They shot at us," she said wonderingly. "The sheriff actually shot at us. Hammond owns him lock, stock, and barrel," Ethan said. "But Watson's lazy. He won't chase us into the mountains, not for this. He'll write up a report saying he tried to collect his pay and forget about it." Lila looked back toward town, though nothing was visible through the trees. "I can never go back, can I?" "Would you want to?" She considered this, then shook her head slowly. "No, there's nothing there for me now except bad memories and false friends." "Then let's get you somewhere safe." Ethan took the mule's lead again. "It's a day's climb to my cabin. Trail gets steep, but we'll take it slow." As they walked, Lila finally asked the question he'd been expecting. "The man you killed, Samuel Kellerman, did you really do it?" "Yes," Ethan said simply. "Why?" "He came to my cabin one night, drunk and mean, said I'd looked at his wife wrong at the town dance. Hadn't even spoken to the woman, just tipped my hat polite-like when she passed." Ethan's voice carried old bitterness. "He pulled a knife, said he was going to teach me manners. We fought. He lost. And they exiled you for that." "His brother Charles owns the biggest logging operation in 3 counties. The judge owed him money, the jury was full of his employees. Truth didn't matter much against all that." They walked in silence for a while, the trail growing steeper as they climbed. Lila had to stop frequently to rest, unused to such exertion, but she never complained. As the sun reached its zenith, Ethan called a proper halt by a mountain stream. "Drink?" he said, offering her his canteen. "And you might want to change out of what's left of that dress. There's clothes in one of those packs, men's clothes, but they'll do better than silk and lace up here." She looked at the pack, then at him. "You planned for this. The clothes, the extra supplies." "I planned for possibilities," he corrected. When I saw what was happening at the church, it seemed like you might need options. While she changed behind a cluster of boulders, Ethan studied their back trail. Still no sign of pursuit, but he spotted something else, fresh horse tracks crossing the trail, heading higher into the mountains. Not Watson's men, these tracks were older, maybe from yesterday. Someone else was in his mountains. "These are much better," Lila said, emerging in brown trousers and a flannel shirt that was too big for her. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of leather, and without the wedding dress she looked younger, but somehow stronger too. "Though I suspect I look ridiculous." "You look like someone who might survive the mountains," Ethan said. "That's all that matters up here." They continued climbing as the afternoon wore on. Ethan told her about the cabin, one-room, sturdy construction with a good fireplace and a separate lean-to for storage. He explained about the spring nearby the garden patch he'd cleared the smokehouse, where he preserved meat for winter. "You've built a whole life up there," she observed. "Built a way to survive," he corrected. "There's a difference." "What difference?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Life involves other people. Surviving just needs yourself." "But you came down today. After 3 years you came to town." "Needed supplies. And ended up spending $3,000 on a stranger." "Your father wasn't a stranger." "He's been dead a month. You didn't know that. Which means you hadn't planned on paying any debts when you came down that mountain this morning." Ethan had no answer for that. The truth was, he didn't entirely understand it himself. Something about seeing her on those church steps, defiant despite her fear, had awakened a part of him he'd thought the mountains had killed. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they reached a plateau where the trail leveled briefly. Ethan stopped, frowning at fresh signs in the dirt. "What is it?" Lila asked. "More tracks. 3 horses, maybe 4 hours old." He stood scanning the tree line. "We're being followed, but not by Watson." "Morrison. Maybe. Or—" He didn't finish the thought, but his hand went to his rifle. "We need to move faster. Can you manage?" She nodded, though he could see exhaustion in every line of her body. They pushed on the trail, growing rougher as shadows lengthened across their path. Ethan's every sense was alert now, reading the forest for signs of danger. It came just as they reached the final approach to his cabin, the crack of a breaking branch that wasn't caused by wind or wildlife. Ethan spun, pushing Lila behind him, rifle raised. "That's far enough, Boone." 3 men emerged from the trees, all armed. Ethan recognized none of them, but their type was familiar enough. Hired guns, the kind Hammond or Morrison might employ for work the sheriff wouldn't do. "Gentlemen," Ethan said calmly, though his finger rested on the trigger, "you're on my land." "Mr. Morrison wants the woman back," the leader said. He was a thin man with dead eyes and a tied-down holster that marked him as someone who fancied himself a gunfighter. "You can walk away from this, Boone. Just hand her over." "The lady's made her choice." "The lady," the man mocked, "belongs to Mr. Morrison, bought and paid for." "Like hell," Lila said, stepping out from behind Ethan, despite his attempt to keep her back. "I belong to no one." The thin man laughed. "Spirited. Morrison likes that. Makes it more fun when they break." Ethan shot him. The sound echoed across the mountain like thunder. The man looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, surprise replacing arrogance on his face, before he toppled backward. The other 2 men froze suddenly, uncertain. Ethan worked the rifle's lever, the mechanical click loud in the sudden silence. "Your friend made a mistake," Ethan said conversationally. "He thought we were negotiating. We're not. You're leaving. Now. And if you're smart, you'll keep going right past Cedar Falls and find work somewhere else. Morrison doesn't pay enough to die for." "You killed Jenkins," one of them said stupidly. "I did. And I'll kill you too if you don't start walking in the next 10 seconds. They looked at each other, then at their dead companion, and made the smart choice. Without another word, they turned and headed back down the trail, moving fast enough that they occasionally stumbled in their haste. Ethan waited until they were out of sight before lowering his rifle. His hands were steady, but inside he felt the old familiar coldness that came with killing. It never got easier, no matter what people said about mountain men and their supposed comfort with death. "You killed him," Lila said softly, not accusing, just stating a fact. He would have taken you back to Morrison. What do you think would have happened then? She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. I know. I've never seen anyone die before. With luck, you'll never have to again. Come on, the cabin's just ahead. They left Jenkins where he fell. The mountains would take care of the body soon enough. As they crested the final rise, Ethan's cabin came into view, a solid structure of logs and stone nestled against a protective cliff face. Smoke still rose from the chimney, the fire he'd banked that morning continuing its slow burn. It's beautiful, Lila said, and seemed to mean it. It's safe, Ethan replied. That's what matters. He showed her inside the single room, sparse but clean. A bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs he'd made himself, shelves lined with preserved foods and a few precious books. The fireplace dominated one wall, its warmth already beginning to chase away the evening chill. You can have the bed, he said. I'll put together a pallet by the fire. I can't take your bed. You can, and you will. You've had a hell of a day, and tomorrow won't be much easier. You need proper rest. She moved around the room slowly, taking in the details. Her fingers traced the spines of his books, a Bible, some Shakespeare, a few dime novels he'd traded for with a traveling peddler. You read, Long winters up here. Man's got to do something to keep his mind working. She pulled out the Shakespeare, opening it carefully. My father loved these plays, used to read them aloud to Mother and me in the evenings. You can borrow it if you like. Thank you. She held the book against her chest like armor. Mr. Boone, Ethan, what happens now? Now we eat something. Get some sleep and figure out the rest tomorrow. Morrison might send more men, or he might decide you're not worth the trouble. Hammond might pressure Watson to form a real posse, or he might let it go. We'll deal with whatever comes. She asked softly, until you decide you want to leave. No one's keeping you here, Lila. This isn't trading one prison for another. She studied his face in the firelight. Why do I feel like I can trust you? I don't even know you. Sometimes that makes it easier, Ethan said, busying himself with preparing a simple meal from his stores. No history to complicate things, no expectations to fail. As they ate salt pork and biscuits in companionable silence, Ethan found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. She'd washed her face in the basin, revealing a spray of freckles across her nose that made her look even younger, but her eyes held a depth that spoke of loss and hard choices. Tell me about the mountains, she said suddenly. What's it like living up here alone for so long? So he told her about the seasons and their different challenges, about the wildlife that had become his only company, about the profound silence that could drive a man mad or heal him depending on his state of mind. He talked more in that hour than he had in the past year, the words flowing like water from a broken dam. She listened intently, asking questions that showed she was truly interested, not just making conversation. When he described the autumn colors that would paint these peaks in a few months, her eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. I've never been further than Millbrook, she admitted. 20 miles from Cedar Falls. My whole world was that small. It's about to get a lot bigger, Ethan said. As the fire burned low and exhaustion finally claimed her, Ethan helped her to the bed, piling on extra blankets against the mountain cold. She was asleep almost instantly, her breathing deep and even. Ethan sat by the dying fire rifle across his knees, thinking about the day's events. In one morning, he'd shattered 10 years of careful isolation. He'd killed a man, made enemies of powerful people, and taken responsibility for a woman he barely knew. And yet, listening to her quiet breathing in the darkness, he felt more alive than he had in a decade. The mountains had kept him safe, but they'd also kept him frozen, suspended in time like an insect in amber. Lila's presence, unexpected and complicated as it was, had cracked that amber wide open. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, its haunting cry echoing off the cliffs. Ethan knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Morrison wouldn't give up easily, and Hammond had too much invested in whatever scheme he'd been planning. There would be more violence, more danger. But for tonight, in this small cabin, high above the world, 2 damaged souls had found an unexpected sanctuary in each other's company. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something, a possibility, a chance for both of them to become more than their circumstances had allowed. As Ethan finally allowed himself to drift toward sleep, still sitting upright with his rifle ready, he thought about Tom Wynne and that long-ago kindness. The old man probably never imagined that hiring a desperate drifter for a few days' work would someday save his daughter from a fate worse than death. Life was strange that way, full of unexpected connections and delayed repercussions. The fire crackled its last sending shadows dancing across the walls before darkness claimed the cabin entirely. Outside the mountains stood their eternal watch, indifferent to human drama, but somehow comforting in their permanence. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, for the first time in 10 years, Ethan Boone was not alone. The morning came too soon, pale light filtering through the cabin's single window and falling across Lila's sleeping face. Ethan had been awake for an hour already, watching the approaches to his cabin through the scope of his rifle. No movement, except for a family of deer picking their way across the meadow below. The two men from yesterday hadn't returned, but that didn't mean they wouldn't. Lila stirred her eyes, opening slowly. Confusion flickering across her features before memory returned. She sat up quickly, the blankets falling away, still dressed in the borrowed clothes from yesterday. "How did you sleep?" Ethan asked, without turning from his position by the window. "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, stretching carefully. "No creditors knocking at dawn, no funeral arrangements to make, no—" She trailed off, and he heard her moving behind him, bare feet soft on the wooden floor. "There's coffee on the stove," he said. "Beans are old, but serviceable." She poured herself a cup, wrapping both hands around it for warmth. The morning air still carried winter's bite despite spring's arrival in the valley below. "You've been watching all night. Most of it, old habits. From your exile. From before that, too. War teaches a man that the hour before dawn is when bad things happen. You fought in the war." She moved to stand beside him at the window, careful not to block his view. Confederate side, though it didn't much matter by the end. Boys killing boys over rich men's principles. I was 15 when I joined up, thought it would be an adventure. His laugh held no humor. Got educated real quick about what men do to each other when they're given permission. Lila was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. My father lost 2 brothers at Antietam, Union side. He never talked about it, but Mother said it changed him, made him value kindness over everything else. Smart man. Ethan finally lowered his rifle, turning to look at her properly in the morning light. "We need to talk about what comes next." "I've been thinking about that," she said, surprising him with her directness. "Morrison won't stop. He's invested too much in this scheme with Hammond, and there's something else. Something about my father's death that doesn't sit right." "What do you mean?" She set down her coffee cup, pacing the small space with nervous energy. "Father was healthy as a horse, never sick a day in his life. Then suddenly he takes ill, can barely speak for the pain in his gut, and dies within 3 days. The doctor said it was appendicitis, but you don't believe it. Father had his appendix removed years ago after it nearly burst when I was 12. I remember because Mother was so frightened, and he kept joking that he'd be lighter without it." Ethan felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "Poison. That's what I think, but I can't prove it, and who would listen to me anyway? Hammond owns half the town, including the sheriff. The doctor. Dr. Marcus. Good man, but old and trusting. He'd believe whatever symptoms were described to him, especially if Hammond was doing the describing." Ethan moved to the stove, pouring his own coffee, while his mind worked through the implications. "So Hammond kills your father, creates a false debt, arranges for Morrison to marry you and gain control of something. What does your family have that they want so badly?" "Just the house and the land it sits on. 5 acres at the edge of town, nothing special." She paused, her eyes widening. "Wait, Father mentioned something a few months ago. Surveyors coming through asking questions about water rights. They were mapping something for the railroad company." "Railroad?" Ethan's interest sharpened. "They're bringing the railroad to Cedar Falls." That was the rumor. Father said they were looking for a route through the valley, needed water access for the steam engines. "Our land backs up to Cedar Creek, and we've always had the water rights from the original homestead claim." "Christ," Ethan muttered. "That's worth a fortune if the railroad comes through. Water rights for a railroad stop could make a man rich for life." "Or make Hammond richer," Lila said bitterly. "He probably knew before anyone else used his banking connections to get inside information. A sound from outside made them both freeze horses approaching on the trail. Ethan grabbed his rifle, moving quickly to the window. 3 riders, he said quietly. Stay back. But as the riders came into view, he relaxed slightly. It's not Morrison's men. That's Ben Holloway and his boys. You know them. Ben traps further up the mountain. Good man minds his own business. Wonder what brings him down here. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. The 3 men reined up at a respectful distance, and Ben, a grizzled mountain man even older than Ethan, raised his hand in greeting. Ethan Boone. Heard you might have some trouble heading your way. News travels fast up here. Met 2 fellows on the trail yesterday evening heading down the mountain like the devil was after them. They were talking about you killing their partner taking some woman from town. Ben's eyes flicked toward the cabin where Lila stood in the doorway. Figured I should warn you they were heading straight for Cedar Falls, and they seemed mighty interested in bringing back reinforcements. Appreciate the warning, Ben. The older man shifted in his saddle. There's more. Saw a camp about 5 miles east of here near Dutchman's Creek. 6 men, maybe 7. Looked like hired guns, not locals. They were studying maps asking my boy Tom here about trails to your cabin. What did Tom tell them? Told them there were lots of trails, and most of them led to places a man wouldn't come back from, Tom said with a grin. He was Ben's youngest, maybe 20, with his father's steady eyes. They didn't much like that answer. They're planning something, Ben continued. Not sure what, but it ain't a social call. You might want to consider moving to higher ground for a while. That old mine shaft up on Eagle's Peak would be defensible. Ethan considered this. The mine was a good defensive position, but it was also a trap if they got surrounded. Thanks for the warning, Ben. You best keep clear of this. It's not your fight. Maybe not, Ben said, but Hammond's been squeezing folks for years. Some of us wouldn't mind seeing him taken down a peg. He touched his hat brim. You need anything, you know where to find us. After they left, Ethan found Lila standing by the table, her face pale but determined. 7 men. They're serious about this. Morrison's probably paying top dollar, or Hammond is, doesn't matter which. Ethan began gathering supplies, his movements efficient. Ben's right about needing to move. This cabin's too exposed if they come in force. Where will we go? There's a place higher up, an old trapper's shelter, harder to find, easier to defend. We can... He stopped, noting her use of we. Lila, you don't have to stay. I could get you over the pass to Millbrook, put you on a stage to anywhere you want to go. She crossed her arms, lifting her chin in that defiant gesture he was beginning to know well. And leave you to face men who are after me. Besides, where would I go? I have no money, no family, nothing but what I'm wearing, which technically belongs to you. I told you there's no debt between us. No, but there's something else. She moved closer, looking up at him with those green eyes that seemed to see right through his defenses. You saved me yesterday, not just from Morrison, but from despair. I'd been fighting alone for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside me. I'm not a good man, Lila. I've killed before, and I'll likely kill again before this is over. Good men don't always survive in bad situations, she replied. Sometimes it takes a dangerous man to stop evil ones. Before he could respond, she was moving around the cabin, helping him pack supplies with surprising efficiency. What should I carry? Ammunition, he said, accepting her help. And the dried meat from that shelf. We might be up there for days. As they worked, he found himself explaining his plans, treating her as a partner rather than a burden. She asked intelligent questions, made practical suggestions, and when he showed her how to load his spare rifle, her hands were steady despite her inexperience. Have you ever shot a gun before? Father taught me to use a pistol when I was 16. Said a woman should know how to defend herself. Morrison found that highly inappropriate when he started courting me last year. Morrison was courting you for a year. Her face darkened. If you can call it that. He'd show up at the store making comments standing too close. Father told him I wasn't interested, but Morrison just smiled and said he was a patient man. Now I know he was waiting for Hammond to arrange things. They loaded their supplies onto the mule, adding blankets and extra ammunition. Ethan saddled his horse, a sturdy mountain breed he'd traded for 2 years ago. You'll ride, I'll lead the mule. I can walk. You'll ride, he repeated firmly. We need to move fast, and you're still exhausted from yesterday. As she mounted the horse, adjusting her position with practiced ease, Ethan allowed himself a moment of admiration. Most women would have been in hysterics by now, faced with killers and wilderness in equal measure. But Lila Wynn had steel in her spine that matched any mountain man's. The trail to the upper shelter was barely visible, more of a game path than anything humans regularly used. Ethan had discovered it his third year in exile, following an elk that led him to the hidden valley where the old trapper's shelter stood. The original builder was long dead, but his construction was solid logs chinked tight against the wind, a stone chimney that drew clean and best of all approaches that could be watched from multiple angles. They climbed steadily for 2 hours, the air growing thinner and colder as they ascended. Patches of snow still clung to northern slopes, and their breath came in visible puffs. Lila never complained, though Ethan could see her gripping the saddle horn tighter as the trail skirted steep drops. "How much further?" she finally asked when they stopped to rest the animals. "Another hour, maybe less." He scanned their back trail looking for signs of pursuit. "You're doing well." "I'm terrified to," she admitted with a shaky laugh. "But it's strange I feel more alive than I have in months. Is that wrong?" "Fear keeps you sharp. It's when you stop being afraid that you get careless." He offered her his canteen. "Tell me about your mother. You said she passed 2 winters ago." "Consumption. She fought it for years, but that last winter was harsh. Father spent everything we had on doctors and medicine, but nothing helped." Her voice carried old grief. "That's probably when Hammond started planning this. He knew Father was vulnerable, desperate enough to maybe take a loan. But he didn't. No, Father sold everything he could, instead Mother's jewelry, the good furniture, even his prize rifle. Said he'd rather be poor than indebted to Hammond." She smiled sadly. He knew what kind of man Hammond was. A crack of gunfire echoed across the mountains, followed by 2 more shots in quick succession. Ethan spun, bringing his rifle up, but the sound was distant, maybe 2 miles down the mountain. "What was that? Warning shots, maybe? Or they found our trail and ran into trouble. These mountains don't suffer fools gladly." He helped her remount quickly. "We need to move." The last stretch of trail was the hardest switchbacking up a near-vertical slope that had the horse and mule laboring for breath. But finally they crested the ridge and dropped into a hidden valley no bigger than a town square. The shelter sat against the far wall, backed by solid rock with clear sight lines in every direction. "It's perfect," Lila breathed, looking around at the natural fortress. "It'll do." Ethan began unloading supplies immediately. "Get inside, check what's there. I need to set up some surprises for our visitors." The shelter was dusty but dry, with a stack of old firewood and even some preserved goods in sealed jars. Lila set about making it habitable while Ethan worked outside. She could hear him moving around occasionally, catching glimpses of him stringing something between trees or positioning rocks in seemingly random patterns. "Tripwires," he explained when she asked, "attached to tin cans with pebbles. Anyone approaching in the dark will announce themselves." "You've done this before." "Different war, same principles." He surveyed his handiwork with grim satisfaction. "They'll probably wait until dark to make their move. Men like that prefer shadows." "How can you be so calm about this?" He turned to look at her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, not calm at all, but a weariness that went bone deep. "Because being afraid won't change what's coming. All we can do is be ready." As afternoon faded toward evening, they prepared for siege. Ethan showed Lila the best positions for defense, explained angles of fire, and Cover drilled her on loading and shooting until her hands moved without thinking. She was a quick study, her determination overcoming her inexperience. "You would have made a good soldier," he said, watching her practice sighting down the rifle barrel. "Women can't be soldiers." Tell that to the Confederate women who defended their homes when the men were gone. Saw more than one Yankee patrol turned back by farmers' wives with squirrel guns. They ate a cold meal as darkness fell, not risking a fire that would pinpoint their location. Sitting close together for warmth, they talked in whispers about inconsequential things, books they'd read, places they'd like to see, foods they missed. It was surreal, this normal conversation while waiting for violence to arrive. "What will you do when this is over?" Lila asked. "You can't go back to your old life here." "Wasn't much of a life," he admitted. Just existing, really, hiding from the world and my own ghosts. And now, he was quiet for a long moment. Now I remember why some things are worth fighting for. Before she could respond, one of his alarms triggered tin cans rattling in the darkness, then another from a different direction. Ethan moved to the window rifle, ready, peering into the moonlit valley. "They're coming," he whispered. "Multiple directions trying to surround us." Lila took her position at the second window, the spare rifle heavy in her hands. Her heart pounded so loud she was sure the attackers must hear it, but her hands remained steady. "Remember what I taught you," Ethan said calmly. "Breathe, squeeze, don't jerk, and don't waste ammunition on shadows." A figure moved at the tree line, visible for just a moment in the moonlight. Ethan's rifle cracked, and the figure dropped. Immediately, gunfire erupted from 3 different positions, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. "Keep your head down," Ethan shouted as bullets thudded into the thick log walls. Lila saw movement to her left and fired the rifle's kick, surprising her despite his warnings. She couldn't tell if she hit anything, but the movement stopped. She worked the lever as he'd taught her, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Ethan was everywhere at once, shooting from one window, then another, reloading with practiced efficiency. His calm directions kept Lila focused despite the chaos. "2 moving up on your side," he called out. "Wait for them to cross that open ground. Now!" She fired, saw one man spin and fall. The other dove for cover, shooting wildly at their position. Ethan's rifle answered, and that gun went silent too. Then as suddenly as it started, the shooting stopped. The silence was almost more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Lila's ears rang and her hand shook as adrenaline coursed through her system. "Is it over?" she whispered. "No. They're regrouping, trying to figure out how many we are." Ethan moved to check his ammunition. "You did good. Real good. I shot someone. Maybe killed him." "He was trying to kill you. Don't apologize for surviving," a voice called out from the darkness. "Boone, this doesn't have to end with more blood. Send the woman out and we'll leave you be." "That's Frank Morrison." Lila whispered, her voice tight with fear and anger. "Thought he might come himself," Ethan murmured. Then louder, "Morrison, the lady doesn't want your company. Any man with sense would have figured that out by now. She doesn't get a choice. She belongs to me." "Last man who said that is feeding the worms," Ethan called back. "You want to join him?" There was a pause, then Morrison's voice came again, closer this time. "You can't hold out forever. We've got more men coming, and you're trapped up there." "Maybe so," Ethan replied, "but the question is how many of you die before you get to us. I count at least 3 down already. How many more are you willing to lose for your pride?" Lila touched his arm. "I could end this. If I went with them." "No." His response was immediate and fierce. "That's not happening." "But if people die because of me, people die because Morrison and Hammond are greedy bastards who think they can take whatever they want. You giving in won't stop that. It'll just teach them they were right." She wanted to argue, but the certainty in his voice stopped her. Instead, she asked, "What do we do?" "We wait. Men like Morrison aren't used to discomfort. Cold night, wounded men, uncertainty. It all works in our favor." The hours crawled by. Occasionally, they'd hear movement outside, see shadows shifting in the moonlight. Twice more gunfire erupted briefly before subsiding. Ethan seemed to have eyes everywhere, catching every movement, responding with carefully placed shots that kept the attackers at bay. As dawn approached, painting the eastern peaks pink and gold, Lila dozed fitfully against Ethan's shoulder. He'd insisted she rest while he kept watch, and exhaustion had finally overcome her resistance. She woke to his gentle shake, immediately alert. "They're pulling back," he said quietly. "Look." She peered out the window to see men carrying wounded down the slope, Morrison's distinctive figure directing them. They'd given up, at least for now. "We won. We survived the night. That's not the same as winning." He stood, stretching muscles cramped from hours of vigilance. "They'll be back, probably with more men and a better plan." "So what do we do?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, watching the last of Morrison's men disappear into the trees. "We take the fight to them. They expect us to stay defensive, wait for the next attack. Instead, we hunt them. Hunt them. I know these mountains better than anyone alive. In open combat, they have the advantage of numbers. But if we turn this into a stalking game, pick them off one by one, make them afraid of every shadow." He smiled grimly. "Well, let's just say the mountains have a way of evening the odds." Lila stood, her legs stiff but her resolve firm. "Then we hunt." As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley, they prepared to leave their sanctuary. The game had changed now. They were no longer prey waiting to be cornered. They were about to become the predators, and Morrison's men would learn what generations of mountain men already knew in these peaks. Death could come from any direction at any moment with no warning but the crack of a rifle and the whisper of a bullet finding its mark. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, giving her one last chance to reconsider. "Once we leave here, there's no going back. We'll be committing to a fight that might not end well." She checked her rifle, her movements now practiced and sure. "I've been running or hiding my whole life, Ethan. From Morrison's advances, from Hammond's schemes, from the fear that I'd end up like my mother, helpless and dependent. I'm done running." He saw the determination in her eyes, the transformation from frightened girl to dangerous woman, and felt something shift in his chest. "Then let's show them why they should have left us alone." They slipped out of the shelter as the morning mist began to rise, two figures melting into the wilderness that would either shelter them or become their grave. Behind them, the abandoned shelter stood empty, a monument to the night they'd survived and the choices they'd made. The hunt was about to begin. The mountain mist clung to them like a living thing as they descended from the shelter, following a route Ethan had scouted years ago when paranoia had driven him to map every possible escape path. Lila moved behind him with surprising grace, her boots finding purchase on the loose shale without sending rocks tumbling to announce their presence. The transformation in her over the past day was remarkable, from terrified bride to armed survivor, though Ethan could still see the tremor in her hands when she thought he wasn't looking. They found Morrison's camp by the smell of coffee and bacon carrying on the morning breeze. The hired guns had set up in a meadow below, exactly where Ethan had predicted, close enough to watch the approaches to the shelter, but far enough to feel safe from rifle fire. Amateur mistake. These were town killers, not mountain fighters. 6 men, Ethan whispered, belly down beside Lila on a ridge overlooking the camp. Morrison and 5 guns. 2 of them are wounded from last night. Through the rifle scope, he could see Morrison pacing, his face red with fury as he gestured wildly at his men. One sat with his arm in a bloody sling, another had a bandage wrapped around his thigh. The remaining 3 looked nervous, constantly scanning the tree line as if death might emerge at any moment. They weren't wrong. "What's the plan?" Lila asked, her voice steady despite the situation. "We make them run. Men like these only fight when they think they'll win. Take away their confidence, make them feel hunted instead of hunters, and they'll break." He showed her how to position herself for a clear shot, how to use the natural cover of rocks and fallen logs. "When I fire, you count to 3, then shoot. Doesn't matter if you hit anything, we want them panicked, not knowing how many we are or where we're shooting from. And then we move. Fast, never stay in one position after firing. These mountains will echo the shots, make it impossible for them to pinpoint our location if we keep moving." Morrison had stopped pacing, was now berating one of his wounded men. The perfect moment. Ethan centered his crosshairs on the coffee pot sitting on their campfire, a detail that would terrify more than a kill shot. He squeezed the trigger. The pot exploded in a spray of hot liquid and metal shards. Men dove for cover, shouting in confusion. Lila's shot followed, splintering a log near their supplies. Then Ethan was pulling her up, both of them running along the pre-planned route as return fire erupted behind them. They circled wide, taking 20 minutes to reach their second position. The camp was in chaos below, men arguing, Morrison screaming orders that contradicted each other. 2 men were trying to saddle horses while keeping behind cover, a nearly impossible task that would have been comical if the situation weren't so deadly. "Again," Ethan said, and this time his shot took the hat off Morrison's head while Lila's struck a tree inches from a gunman's face. They were gone before the echo faded, leaving only confusion in their wake. By the 3rd attack, one of the hired guns had enough. They watched from concealment as he threw his gear on his horse and rode off despite Morrison's threats. By the fourth, another two departed, these wounded men deciding no amount of money was worth dying in these mountains. It's working. Lila breathed, exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. Don't get cocky. Desperate men are dangerous men. But Ethan allowed himself a small smile. The odds were evening. As the sun reached its zenith, they watched Morrison's reduced party break camp. Only 2 gunmen remained with him, and they moved like spooked deer weapons, drawn heads swiveling at every sound. They were retreating, but not toward Cedar Falls. Instead, they headed east toward Dutchman's Creek. That's where Ben said the other group was camped, Ethan muttered. Morrison's going for reinforcements. How many men does he have? Enough to make our tricks less effective. Come on, we need to get ahead of them. They pushed hard through the afternoon, taking game trails that cut straight across slopes the horses had to switch back down. Lila kept pace despite her exhaustion, driven by something deeper than physical strength. When they finally stopped at a stream to drink and rest, Ethan saw her hands were bleeding from grabbing at rocks and branches. Let me see, he said, taking her hands gently in his. The skin was torn in several places, dirt ground into the wounds. It's nothing, she protested, but let him clean the cuts with water from the stream and bind them with strips torn from his shirt. You're tougher than you look, he said, trying not to notice how small her hands were in his, how her fingers trembled slightly at his touch. I had a good teacher. She met his eyes, and something passed between them. Not quite affection, not yet, but recognition of something growing in the space between shared danger and mutual trust. The moment broke when they heard horses approaching on the trail below. Morrison's voice carried clearly in the mountain air, still raging about incompetent help and women who didn't know their place. Ethan's jaw tightened at the casual violence in the man's tone, the assumption of ownership that dripped from every word. We could end it here, Lila whispered. 3 men, we have the high ground. Could, Ethan agreed. But killing Morrison would bring the law down harder. He's a prominent citizen, regardless of being a bastard. Better if he just disappears. Disappears? Ethan's smile was cold. These mountains are full of dangers. Bears, mountain cats, loose rocks over steep drops. Sometimes men just don't come back. They shadowed Morrison's group through the afternoon, staying high on the ridges where horses couldn't follow. As evening approached, they reached Dutchman's Creek ahead of their quarry and found the larger camp Ben had described. 8 more men well-armed and organized. These weren't town toughs, but professional killers probably brought in from Denver or Salt Lake City. Too many, Ethan said, studying the camp through his scope. We can't take them all. Then what do we do? He was quiet for a long moment, considering options. Then his expression changed, something dark and calculating, replacing his usual careful control. We don't fight them. We turn them against each other. That night, while Morrison met with the leader of the hired guns, a scarred man named Garrett, who wore his pistols low and tied down, Ethan and Lila crept close to their camp. The plan was dangerous, requiring them to get within 50 yards of armed killers, but Ethan had learned long ago that the best defense was often chaos among your enemies. They waited until the men had been drinking for an hour, their voices growing louder and their attention wavering. Then Ethan put his plan into action. His first shot took out their whiskey bottle, sending glass and alcohol spraying across the fire. His second killed one of their horses, Morrison's distinctive bay stallion. In the confusion that followed, Lila played her part perfectly. Her voice carried across the darkness, high and mocking. Morrison, you coward! Sending boys to do a man's job. Why don't you face me yourself? The hired guns erupted in accusations. Who had been on watch? How had a woman gotten so close? Morrison's rage turned on Garrett, accusing him of incompetence, of taking money without delivering results. Garrett, his pride stung and whiskey courage flowing, responded in kind. Ethan's third shot, carefully placed, struck the ground between the 2 men just as their argument reached its peak. Both drew their weapons, each thinking the other had fired. Only the quick intervention of their men prevented bloodshed, but the damage was done. Trust was broken, and in these mountains, trust was all that kept men alive. They retreated as voices rose in the camp, accusations flying like bullets. By morning, Ethan knew some of those men would be gone. Fear and mistrust were more effective than any ammunition. You're devious, Lila said as they made their way back to their own cold camp hidden in a cluster of rocks a mile away. Alive and devious beats honorable and dead, he replied. They spent the night pressed close together for warmth, not daring to light a fire that might give away their position. Neither spoke about the intimacy of their situation, the way their bodies fitted together like puzzle pieces, or how natural it felt to wake with her head on his shoulder and his arm protective around her. Morning brought exactly what Ethan had hoped for division in the enemy camp. Through his scope, he watched 3 of Garrett's men packing their gear, clearly done with the job. Garrett himself was in heated discussion with Morrison, their body language suggesting violence barely restrained. They're falling apart, Lila observed, sharing the scope with him. Money only buys loyalty so far. When men start thinking they might not live to spend it, calculations change. They maintained their harassment throughout the day, a shot here, a sighting there, always keeping the hunters off balance and afraid. By evening, Garrett's group had shrunk to 4 men, and Morrison was down to his last loyal gunman. It was then that everything changed. A new group of riders appeared on the trail, not hired guns, but townspeople from Cedar Falls. Ethan recognized several faces, Henry, from the general store, Tom Wynn's old friend Samuel Peters, even Doc Marcus. They were armed but didn't carry themselves like killers. "What are they doing here?" Lila gasped. The answer became clear as the riders reached Morrison's camp. Samuel Peters, a man who'd run the livery stable for 30 years, stepped forward as their spokesman. "Frank Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of righteous anger. "We've come to take you back to Cedar Falls. There's questions need answering about Tom Wynn's death." Morrison's laugh was ugly. "You pathetic shopkeepers dare to threaten me." "Not threatening," Peters replied calmly. "Arresting. We've formed a citizens' committee, seeing as Sheriff Watson seems unable to do his job. Doc Marcus here has new information about Tom's death, and we mean to see justice done. You have no authority." "We have the authority of honest folk tired of being squeezed by you and Hammond," another man called out. "And we've got guns to back it up, if needed." Ethan felt Lila tense beside him. They're standing up to him. After all these years, they're finally standing up. Your father's death was the last straw, seems like. The confrontation below was escalating. Morrison's hired guns looked uncertain. They'd been paid to hunt a mountain man and a woman, not face down a citizen's posse. Garrett made a decision, raising his hands and backing away. "This ain't our fight," he announced. "You want to settle town business? Settle it. We're done here." Morrison's face went purple with rage as Garrett and his remaining men mounted up and rode away, leaving him with just one supporter against a dozen angry townspeople. Even that man looked ready to bolt. "You can't do this," Morrison screamed. "Hammond will have you all hanged." "Hammond's got his own problems," Peters replied. "Federal marshals arrived this morning investigating some interesting irregularities in his banking practices. Seems someone sent them a package of documents about false debts and forged signatures. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Morrison reached for his pistol, but 3 rifles swung to cover him before his hand touched the grip. "Don't be stupid, Frank," Doc Marcus said. "You're done. It's over." Watching from above, Ethan felt a savage satisfaction as Morrison was disarmed and his hands bound. The tyrant who'd tried to force Lila into marriage, who'd sent killers after them, was being led away like a common criminal. "We should go down," Lila said. "Tell them what really happened." "Not yet. Let's see how this plays out first." They watched the posse leave with Morrison in custody, his last gunman having abandoned him to his fate. As the dust settled and silence returned to the mountains, Ethan and Lila were left alone with the weight of what had just occurred. "It's over," she said wonderingly. "It's really over." "Maybe," Ethan said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Hammond wouldn't give up so easily. Men like him didn't build empires by accepting defeat. They made their way back to Ethan's cabin as darkness fell, both exhausted beyond measure, but too wired with adrenaline to rest. The cabin felt strange after their time in the wild, too civilized, too confined. They stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure how to navigate this new reality where they weren't running or fighting for their lives. "I should heat some water," Lila finally said. We both need to wash. While she busied herself at the stove, Ethan checked his supplies and weapons, needing the familiar routine to ground himself. The past 3 days felt like 3 years' time compressed and stretched by danger and proximity to death. Ethan, Lila said softly. He turned to find her standing by the table, hands clasped nervously. What happens now with us, I mean? He'd been dreading this question, knowing it would come. You're free now. Morrison's done, probably headed for prison. You can go back to Cedar Falls, reclaim your father's property. That's not what I asked. The directness of her response made him look at her properly. She'd washed her face and hands, pulled her hair back, and in the lamplight she looked young and vulnerable, but also fiercely determined. Lila, I can't offer you anything. I'm still in exile, still wanted for killing Kellerman. This cabin, these mountains, this is all I have. I didn't ask what you could offer, she said, moving closer. I asked what happens with us. Because something happened out there, Ethan. We became something together that neither of us is alone. He wanted to deny it, to send her away for her own good, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself reaching for her, pulling her against him in an embrace that was part relief, part recognition of a truth he'd been fighting. I don't know how to be with someone, he admitted against her hair. 10 years alone changes a man. Then we learn together, she said simply. If you want to. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Ethan grabbed his rifle, pushing Lila behind him as he moved to the window. But instead of threat, he saw Salvation Sheriff Watson approaching under a white flag, accompanied by Samuel Peters and, surprisingly, Judge Harrison from the Territorial Court. Ethan Boone, the judge called out. We come in peace, need to talk with you. Warily. Ethan stepped onto the porch, rifle lowered but ready. Judge Harrison, bit far from your courthouse. Extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary measures, the judge replied, dismounting with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to hard riding. May we come in? What I have to say affects both you and Miss Wynne. Once inside, the judge accepted coffee gratefully before explaining his presence. Federal investigation into Hammond's bank has uncovered extensive corruption, including bribing territorial officials and falsifying legal documents. Among those documents were the trial records from your case, Mr. Boone. Ethan's grip on his coffee cup tightened. What about them? They were falsified, witness testimonies that were never given evidence that didn't exist. Charles Kellerman paid Hammond to ensure your conviction regardless of the truth. The judge's weathered face showed genuine regret. Your exile was illegal, Mr. Boone. The territorial government is prepared to issue a full pardon and restore your rights as a citizen. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. 10 years of exile, of isolation and survival, all based on lies and corruption. He felt Lila's hand find his, anchoring him as his world shifted. Additionally, the judge continued, Morrison has confessed to poisoning Tom Wynne on Hammond's orders. Both men will hang for murder. Miss Wynne, your father's property is yours, free and clear, along with a substantial settlement from Hammond's seized assets. I don't want blood money, Lila said quietly. It's not blood money, it's justice, Peters interjected. Your father would want you provided for. The judge stood, preparing to leave. Mr. Boone, you're free to return to Cedar Falls whenever you choose. The town owes you an apology and a debt of gratitude. Your actions these past days helped expose Hammond's entire network of corruption. After they left, Ethan and Lila sat in stunned silence. Everything they'd fought for, suffered for, had suddenly resolved itself through legal channels they'd never expected to function. You can go home, Ethan said finally. So can you. Cedar Falls was never home, just a place I passed through. And now, he looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd been thrust into his life through violence but had somehow brought light to his darkness. Now I don't know where home is anymore. She stood moving to stand before him, her hands framing his face. Home isn't a place, Ethan. It's people. It's choosing to build something together instead of just surviving alone. You'd stay here in this cabin in these mountains. I'd stay with you wherever that leads, unless... Uncertainty flickered across her features. Unless you want to be alone again. For answer, he pulled her down to him, kissing her with 10 years of loneliness, finally breaking like a dam. When they parted, both breathing hard, he saw his own wonder reflected in her eyes. "I don't want to be alone anymore," he admitted, "but I don't know how to be anything else. Then we figure it out together, day by day, season by season." That night, as they lay together in the bed he'd built for one, but that somehow perfectly fit two, Ethan told her about his years in the mountains. About the first terrible winter when he'd nearly died, about the beauty of autumn, when the aspens turned gold, about the profound silence that could drive men mad, or heal them, depending on their state of mind. "Were you healed?" she asked. Her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I thought I was. Thought I'd found peace in isolation. But it wasn't peace, just numbness. You can't heal from wounds to the soul without other souls to remind you what being human means." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother used to say that people were like plants. Some thrived in solitude, like the pine trees standing alone and tall, but others were like aspens needing to grow in groves, their roots intertwined underground so deeply you couldn't tell where one ended and another began." "Which are you?" "I thought I was a pine. Tried to be, especially after she died. But these past days with you, I think I'm an aspen. I need connection even if it scares me. And what am I?" She rose up on one elbow, studying his face in the moonlight filtering through the window. "You're a pine that's been alone so long you forgot that even pines drop seeds, create forests. You're not meant to stand alone forever, Ethan." He pulled her back down, holding her close, marveling at how natural it felt. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and the familiar sound seemed to bless this new configuration of his world. "Tomorrow, we should go to town," she said sleepily. "Face whatever needs facing, settle whatever needs settling." "Tomorrow," he agreed. "But tonight, just this. Just us." As sleep took them, the mountains stood their eternal watch, indifferent to human drama, but somehow complicit in this small miracle, two damaged souls finding wholeness in each other, building something that might, with luck and courage, grow strong enough to weather any storm. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Their breathing synchronized deep and even, the peaceful sleep of those who'd faced death together and chosen life. Outside clouds gathered over the peaks, promising rain by morning rain that would wash away the blood and fear of recent days, leaving the world clean and ready for new growth. The rain came as promised, drumming against the cabin roof in a steady rhythm that woke them just after dawn. Ethan lay still, adjusting to the unfamiliar weight of another person beside him, the warmth of Lila's body curved against his side. For 10 years he'd awakened alone to silence or wind or birdsong, but never to the soft breathing of another human being. The novelty of it made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. She stirred her green eyes, opening slowly, confusion flickering across her features before memory returned. A blush colored her cheeks as she realized their proximity, but she didn't pull away. "Morning," she said softly, her voice rough with sleep. "Morning. Rain's coming down hard. Might want to wait before heading to town. Are you looking for excuses to delay?" She propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face with that direct gaze he was learning to both appreciate and fear. "Maybe." He reached up to tuck a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, marveling at his own boldness. "Once we go down there, everything changes. You become the wealthy inheritor of your father's estate. I become the wrongly exiled man returned. We stop being just Ethan and Lila who survived something together." "We'll still be that too," she said, but uncertainty shadowed her eyes. They both knew how quickly the world could intrude on private happiness, how public opinion could poison even the sweetest well. They rose and dressed with awkward politeness, navigating the small space with careful consideration for each other's privacy. Ethan made coffee while Lila cooked breakfast from his stores, the domestic routine feeling both foreign and oddly right. As they ate, the rain began to lessen sunlight, breaking through clouds in golden shafts that turned the wet forest into something magical. "We should go," Lila said finally. "Putting it off won't make it easier." The ride down to Cedar Falls took longer than usual, the trail muddy and treacherous from the rain. Ethan rode behind Lila on his horse, leading the mule with their supplies. Her body pressed back against his with each sway of the horse's gait, and he found himself thinking about things he had no business thinking about, futures he had no right to imagine. As they descended, the forest gave way to cleared land and the town came into view. It looked different somehow, though Ethan couldn't immediately say why. Then he realized Hammond's Bank, the largest building on Main Street, had its windows boarded up, and a federal marshal's notice was posted on the door. People emerged from buildings as they rode down Main Street, faces showing a mixture of curiosity, shame, and something that might have been hope. Henry Brennan stepped out of his store, raising his hand in greeting. "Miss Lila, Mr. Boone, good to see you both safe." They dismounted in front of the general store, and immediately a small crowd gathered. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Lila touched his arm gently, stilling him. "They're not threatening us," she murmured. Indeed, the faces turned toward them showed more curiosity than hostility. Samuel Peters pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with what looked like relief. "Miss Lila, we've been worried. After Morrison was arrested, we didn't know if you were safe up there." "Mr. Boone kept me safe," she said simply, and Ethan noticed how she stood slightly closer to him, presenting them as a unit rather than two separate people. "About that," Peters said, addressing Ethan directly. "The town owes you an apology, sir. We let fear and Hammond's money blind us to justice. What was done to you 10 years ago was wrong, and our silence made us complicit." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He'd imagined many returns to Cedar Falls over the years, most involving violence or stealth. This public acknowledgement of wrongdoing left him unsure how to respond. "What's done is done," he said finally. "Can't change the past." "No, but we can try to make the future better," Doc Marcus said, joining the group. "Miss Lila, there are matters regarding your father's estate that need attention. The federal investigators have released the property, and there's considerable assets that Hammond was hiding." "How considerable?" Lila asked. "The water rights alone are worth a fortune with the railroad coming through. Plus there's the compensation settlement the territorial government approved." "You're a wealthy woman, Miss Lila. Wealthy enough to do whatever you choose." Ethan felt her stiffen beside him, saw the calculation in the crowd's eyes. Yesterday she'd been the desperate daughter forced into marriage to pay debts. Today she was an heiress, and that changed everything in a town like Cedar Falls. "I need to see the house," Lila said quietly. "My father's house." They walked together through town, the crowd following at a respectful distance. The Wynn house sat on the outskirts, a modest two-story structure with a wide porch and views of the mountains. Someone had maintained it in the weeks since Tom's death. The garden was weeded, the porch swept clean. "I've been looking after it," Mrs. Patterson said, emerging from the crowd. She'd run the boarding house for 20 years, one of the few who'd shown kindness to Ethan before his exile. "Didn't seem right to let Tom's work go to waste." Lila's eyes filled with tears as she climbed the porch steps, her hand trailing along the railing her father had built. Ethan hung back, uncertain of his place here, but she turned and held out her hand to him. "Come with me," she said. "Please." Inside the house was exactly as Tom Wynn had left it, neat, orderly, with books everywhere and the faint smell of pipe tobacco still lingering. Lila moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects, pausing at family photographs. "This was their wedding portrait," she said, showing Ethan a faded daguerreotype of a younger Tom Wynn and a woman who could only be Lila's mother. The resemblance was striking, though Lila had a strength in her jaw that must have come from her father. "You look like her." She was beautiful. Father always said I got her beauty, but his stubbornness. Her voice broke slightly. "I miss them both so much." Ethan pulled her against him, letting her cry into his shirt, feeling the shudders that ran through her body. The crowd had remained outside, giving them this private moment, but he could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing against the windows. When her tears subsided, they explored the rest of the house. In Tom's study, they found something unexpected. A letter addressed to Lila dated the day before his death. With trembling hands, she opened it and read aloud, "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then Hammond has moved against me sooner than expected. I write this in haste, knowing that by tomorrow I may not be able to write at all. Hammond and Morrison have been planning something involving our land for months. I've hidden documents in the old Bible that prove their corruption. Use them if you can. But more importantly, know this: you are stronger than you believe, braver than you know. Don't let them break you, my dear one. Your mother's spirit lives in you, and it will see you through whatever comes. Trust your heart even when the world tells you not to. All my love, Father. He knew, Lila whispered. He knew they were going to kill him. Why didn't he run? Because running would have meant leaving everything to them. The house, the land, the water rights, it would all have gone to Hammond by default. She folded the letter carefully. He stayed to protect my inheritance, even knowing it would cost him his life. In the Bible, they found what Tom had: hidden deeds, contracts correspondence between Hammond and various officials, evidence of a conspiracy that reached to the territorial capital. There was also something else, something that made Ethan's blood run cold: a letter from Charles Kellerman to Hammond, dated 10 years ago, discussing the plan to frame Ethan for murder. My God, Lila breathed. They planned it all. Samuel Kellerman's death, your exile, everything. Charles sent his own brother to kill me, knowing I'd defend myself, Ethan said, his voice hollow. Sacrificed his own blood for profit. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Watson stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking deeply uncomfortable. Miss Lila, Mr. Boone. Sorry to intrude, but there's someone here needs to speak with you. Says it's urgent. They followed Watson to his office, where a well-dressed man waited. He introduced himself as Theodore Blackwood, attorney from Denver, representing the railroad company. I'll be direct, Blackwood said. The railroad needs your water rights, Miss Wynne. We're prepared to pay handsomely $50,000 for exclusive access. Lila gasped at the sum, but Ethan noticed something in Blackwood's eyes, a hunger that suggested the rights were worth even more. That's a lot of money, Lila said carefully. It's a fair offer. You could live comfortably for the rest of your life. Or she could lease the rights annually and make that much every 5 years, Ethan interjected. The railroad's not going anywhere once it's built. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You're advising Miss Wynne now. He's helping me understand my options, Lila said, moving closer to Ethan. I'll need time to consider your offer. Of course. I'll be at the hotel for 3 days. Blackwood stood, then paused. A word of advice, Miss Wynne. A woman alone with such wealth becomes a target. You might consider taking a husband for protection. After he left, Watson cleared his throat awkwardly. There's another matter. Charles Kellerman is in town. Came in this morning demanding justice for his brother. Ethan's hand went to his gun. The murder charge was cleared. It was, but he's not accepting that. Says he wants satisfaction one way or another. Watson looked miserable. I can't stop a man from calling you out, Boone, not if you accept. Where is he? The saloon. Been drinking since he arrived, working up his courage. Ethan stood, but Lila grabbed his arm. Don't go, please. We can leave, go back to the cabin. He'll follow. Men like Kellerman don't give up. He touched her face gently. I've been running from this for 10 years. Time to end it. The walk to the saloon felt like a funeral procession. Word had spread and people lined the streets. Some looked eager for blood sport, others fearful of the violence to come. Lila walked beside him, chin high, refusing to show the fear he knew she felt. The saloon was nearly empty except for Charles Kellerman sitting at a corner table with a bottle of whiskey. He looked older than Ethan remembered, his hair gone gray, his face lined with bitterness. When he saw Ethan, he stood slowly, hand hovering near his pistol. Murderer, he said, his voice slurred but venomous. Your brother came to kill me, Charles. You sent him. Prove it. Ethan pulled out the letter they'd found, tossing it on the bar. Your own words prove it. You planned the whole thing with Hammond. Kellerman's face went white as he recognized the letter. For a moment, Ethan thought he might back down. Then rage replaced shock and his hand went for his gun. Ethan was faster. He'd always been faster. But as his hand touched his pistol grip, Lila stepped between them. No, she said firmly. This ends now. Get out of the way, woman, Kellerman snarled. No, you want to shoot someone. Shoot me. Add another murder to your conscience. She stood straight facing him without flinching. Your brother is dead because you sent him to kill. Mr. Boone is innocent of murder, and you know it. The question is whether you're going to compound your crimes with another death or whether you're going to walk away and live with what you've done. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You're a small, bitter man who destroyed lives for money. You sent your own brother to die and ruined Mr. Boone's life to cover your crimes. But it's over now. Hammond is going to hang Morrison too. Your empire is crumbling. Kill us, and you'll hang alongside them. Walk away, and you might salvage something from the wreckage. Kellerman's hand shook on his gun. The saloon was deadly quiet, everyone waiting to see which way the violence would break. Then slowly his hand fell away from his weapon. "This isn't over," he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "Yes, it is," Sheriff Watson said from the doorway. "Charles Kellerman, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. The federal marshals have been looking for you." As Watson led Kellerman away in irons, the saloon erupted in whispers. Lila turned to Ethan, her whole body shaking now that the danger had passed. "You stepped between us," he said, wonder and anger warring in his voice. "You could have been killed." "So could you, and I've lost enough people I care about." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "No more killing Ethan. We've had enough of death." He kissed her there in the saloon in front of everyone, not caring about propriety or scandal. When they parted, the crowd was silent. Then someone, Mrs. Patterson, started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the saloon rang with applause that seemed to be for more than just their embrace. It was approval acceptance, perhaps even forgiveness for the town's past sins. Over the next days, they settled Tom Wynn's affairs. Lila negotiated with the railroad, eventually agreeing to a lease that would provide steady income while maintaining ownership of the water rights. She also established a fund for the families Hammond had destroyed, using part of the compensation settlement to help those who'd lost farms and businesses to his predatory practices. But even as she handled business with remarkable acumen, Ethan could see her struggling with the weight of sudden wealth and responsibility. At night in the boarding house, where they'd taken separate rooms to maintain propriety, he'd hear her pacing, unable to sleep. On the third night, she knocked on his door. "I can't do this," she said when he let her in. "Everyone looks at me differently now. They see money, not me. Even the ones who mean well treat me like I'm made of glass." "What do you want to do?" She moved to the window, looking up at the mountains visible in the moonlight. "I want to go home. To the cabin. Is that crazy?" "The cabin's not a home, it's just a shelter. It was home when we were there together." She turned to face him. "Everything down here feels false, like playing a role in a play I don't understand. Up there, I knew who I was." "You're romanticizing it. Winter in those mountains is brutal. No comfort, no society, no pretense," she interrupted. "No one watching every move, judging every decision. Just us and the mountains and whatever we build together." "Lila, you're asking to give up everything. Your inheritance, your place in society." "I'm not giving it up. The lease money will come whether I'm here or in the mountains. As for society," she laughed bitterly. "The same society that would have watched Morrison buy me like cattle, I don't need their approval." "What about a family, children?" "You can't raise children in that cabin." She was quiet for a moment, then moved closer to him. "Can't I didn't mountain families raise children for generations before towns existed? Besides, who says we have to stay in that exact cabin forever? We could build something bigger, better. Use some of my money to create a real home, not just a shelter." "You've thought about this." "I've thought about nothing else. Ethan, I'm not asking you to marry me or make any promises you're not ready for. I'm just saying I want to go back to the mountains with you and see what we could build together. If it doesn't work, I can always come back down." He studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the determination there, the same strength that had carried her through their ordeal. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They left Cedar Falls 2 days later after Lila had finalized all necessary legal arrangements. The town turned out to see them off some, puzzled by her choice, others seeming to understand. Mrs. Patterson pressed a package of books into Lila's hands for the long winter nights. Doc Marcus provided medical supplies and promises to visit come spring. Even Sheriff Watson seemed relieved to see them go, as if their presence reminded the town too much of its recent sins. The ride up the mountain felt different this time. Not an escape, but a journey toward something. Lila rode her own horse, now purchased with her newfound wealth, and pack mules carried supplies and tools for building. She'd also insisted on buying glass windows, real ones, to replace the oiled paper in Ethan's cabin. Glass windows are a luxury, but, he'd protested. Light is not a luxury, she'd countered. It's a necessity for the soul. As they climbed higher, leaving civilization behind, Ethan found himself seeing the mountains through her eyes. The autumn colors were beginning to turn, painting the aspens gold and the oak brush red. She gasped at vistas he'd long taken for granted, found beauty in the harsh landscape that had been merely backdrop to his survival. They reached the cabin as sunset painted the peaks pink and purple. It looked smaller than he remembered, more primitive. For a moment he worried she'd realize her mistake, but she dismounted with a smile. "Home," she said simply, and began unloading supplies with practical efficiency. That night, as they sat by the fire planning modifications to the cabin, Ethan realized something had fundamentally changed. The space no longer felt like exile, but like possibility. Lila sketched designs on paper she'd brought, talking about additions. They could build gardens, they could plant a proper root cellar for preserving food. "You're planning for permanence," he observed. "Aren't you?" He considered the question. For 10 years he'd lived day to day, season to season, never planning beyond survival. The idea of building something lasting, something shared, terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Build a life with someone." "Neither do I, but look what we survived when we didn't know what we were doing. Imagine what we could accomplish if we actually tried." A wolf howled in the distance, its call echoing across the valley. Once it would have sounded lonely to Ethan. Now it sounded like wildness calling to wildness, like the mountains welcoming them home. "All right," he said. "We try. We build. We see what grows." She smiled, moving to sit beside him, fitting against his side like she belonged there. "That's all I'm asking. A chance to see what we could grow together." As the fire burned low and stars emerged overhead, they sat planning their future, practical things like construction and supplies, dreamy things like children's names and fruit trees that might survive at altitude. The mountains listened to their voices with ancient patience, having seen generations of dreamers come and go, but perhaps blessing these two who'd found each other through violence and chosen to answer with creation. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of building, the challenge of merging two solitary souls into partnership. There would be arguments and accommodations, compromises and celebrations. Winter would test them with its brutal cold and isolation. Spring would bring its own challenges and rewards. But tonight, they had each other, and the vast possibility of the future stretching before them like the mountain vista, beautiful, dangerous, and infinite with promise. The cabin that had been Ethan's prison and salvation would become something new, a foundation for the life they would build together, log by log, season by season, until even the mountains would recognize it as home. The first snow came earlier than expected, catching them in the middle of raising the new room's walls. Ethan cursed as fat flakes began covering the fresh-cut logs they'd spent weeks preparing, while Lila laughed at his consternation, her face flushed from exertion and cold. They'd been working since dawn, racing against the season to complete the addition before winter set in properly. "It's just snow, Ethan," she said, brushing flakes from her hair. "It won't hurt the wood." "Snow means frozen ground. Frozen ground means we can't set the foundation proper for the rest." He squinted at the darkening sky. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." She moved to stand beside him, surveying their work. In the 2 months since returning to the mountains, they'd accomplished more than Ethan had in his entire decade of exile. The cabin now had real glass windows that caught the morning light, a new iron stove Lila had ordered from Denver, and the beginnings of what would be a proper bedroom addition. "We can finish the roof at least," she said. "Keep the snow out of what we've built." They worked through the afternoon as the snow thickened, their movements synchronized from weeks of laboring together. Lila had surprised him with her strength and determination, never complaining about blisters or exhaustion, matching him hour for hour in the hard work of construction. By nightfall, they had the roof frame up and covered with canvas, a temporary solution, but enough to protect their progress. Inside the original cabin, now warm from the new stove, they collapsed at the table, exhausted but satisfied. Lila had made venison stew from a deer Ethan had taken the week before, and the rich smell filled the small space. As they ate, wind howled outside, driving snow against the windows in rattling gusts. First blizzard of the year, Ethan noted, could last days. Good thing we stocked supplies. She gestured to the shelves now lined with preserved foods, sacks of flour and beans enough to last months if necessary. Her inheritance money had been put to practical use, ensuring they'd never face the desperate hunger Ethan had known in his early exile years. A loud crack from outside made them both freeze. It sounded like wood breaking, but heavier, more deliberate than wind damage. Ethan reached for his rifle, motioning for Lila to stay quiet. Another crack closer this time, followed by what sounded like footsteps on the porch. "Ethan Boone," a voice called out, barely audible over the wind. "We need help." Ethan recognized the voice, Ben Holloway. He opened the door carefully, rifle ready to find Ben and his son Tom, supporting a third man between them, all three covered in snow and blood. "What happened?" "Found him on the trail," Ben gasped as they helped the injured man inside. "Shot twice, left for dead. Knew you had medical supplies up here." The wounded man was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and features that looked Mexican or Spanish. 2 bullet wounds marked his torso, one in the shoulder, another lower near his ribs. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. "Get him on the bed," Lila ordered, immediately taking charge. "Ethan, heat water. Mr. Holloway, I need those medical supplies from the shelf." She worked with surprising competence, cleaning the wounds while Ethan and Ben held the man still. The shoulder wound was clean, the bullet having passed through, but the lower wound was worse, the bullet still lodged, bleeding steadily. "I need to get that bullet out," she said, her face pale but determined. "I watched Doc Marcus do this once, but you can do it," Ethan said firmly. "Tell us what you need." For the next hour, she worked with steady hands, using tools sterilized in boiling water to probe for the bullet while the rest of them held the patient still. When she finally extracted the lead, blood flowed freely before she could pack the wound. The man groaned, stirring towards consciousness, muttering in Spanish. "What's he saying?" Ben asked. "Something about his sister," Ethan translated, surprising himself with remembered Spanish from his war days. "He's looking for his sister." As Lila finished bandaging the wounds, the man's eyes opened fully. He looked around wildly, trying to rise, but Ethan held him down gently. "You're safe," he said in Spanish. "You were shot. We're helping you." The man's eyes focused on him, then shifted to Lila. You saved me." "She did," Ethan confirmed. "Who shot you?" "Kellerman's men." The name made everyone in the room tense. "They have my sister. Took her from our farm near Millbrook. I tried to stop them." "Charles Kellerman is in jail," Ben said. The wounded man laughed bitterly. "Not Charles. His son Vincent. Worse than his father. He came back from California with men, lots of men. Says the law has no authority since his father was falsely imprisoned." Ethan and Lila exchanged glances. They'd known Charles Kellerman had a son, but he'd been away for years, supposedly making his fortune in the gold fields. "Why did they take your sister?" Lila asked. "She witnessed them killing a federal marshal, the one investigating the family's crimes. They're holding her at the old Kellerman logging camp, planning to move her tomorrow, sell her to traders heading for Mexico." "How many men?" Ethan's voice had gone cold. 10, maybe 12, all killers." The young man tried to sit up again. "I have to go back. Maria is only 16. You're not going anywhere with those wounds," Lila said firmly. "You'd be dead before you reached the tree line." "Then she's lost." Tears ran down his face. "My little sister is lost." Ethan stood abruptly, moving to the window. Through the driving snow, he could see nothing but white. But in his mind, he saw another young woman, terrified and alone, being sold into slavery because she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "How far is the logging camp?" he asked. "Ethan, no," Lila said, knowing where his thoughts were heading. "You can't." 8 miles northeast," Ben answered, understanding too. "But in this storm..." "Storm works both ways. They won't expect anyone coming in this weather." Ethan was already gathering his gear. "Ben, can you and Tom stay here, protect the cabin?" "We're coming with you," Tom said immediately, but Ethan shook his head. "Need you here. If something happens to me, get Lila to safety." "If something happens to you, I'll kill you myself," Lila said fiercely. She grabbed her own rifle. "I'm coming." "Absolutely not." You can argue and waste time, or you can accept that I'm coming and plan accordingly. Her green eyes blazed with determination. That girl needs help. I won't sit here warming my hands while she suffers. They stared at each other for a long moment, wills clashing. Finally, Ethan nodded. Get dressed warm. We leave in 10 minutes. The wounded man they'd learned his name was Miguel drew a rough map of the logging camp, marking guard positions and where they likely held his sister. There's an old equipment shed on the north side. That's where they keep prisoners before transport. As they prepared to leave, Ben pulled Ethan aside. This is suicide, you know that 2 against 12 in a blizzard. Probably, but I can't sit by and let them sell a girl into slavery, not when I can do something about it. You've changed, Ben observed. The old Ethan Boone would have minded his own business. Ethan glanced at Lila, who was checking her rifle with grim efficiency. The old Ethan Boone didn't have anything worth protecting, or anyone who'd stand beside him in a fight. They left the cabin as the storm reached its full fury, snow driving horizontally, visibility reduced to mere feet. Ethan led breaking trail through drifts that reached their knees, Lila following in his footsteps. They navigated by instinct and memory, the familiar mountains made alien by the white shroud. It took 3 hours to cover what should have been a 2-hour journey. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the logging camp, both were exhausted faces, numb from cold despite their wrappings. Below, lights glowed through the storm lanterns in what had to be the main building. Can't see the guards, Lila said through chattering teeth. They'll be inside staying warm. Stupid, but lucky for us. Ethan studied the layout, comparing it to Miguel's map. The shed is their north side. 1 door, probably 1 guard. They circled wide, using the storm as cover until they reached the back of the equipment shed. Through gaps in the wooden walls, they could hear crying young female, terrified. Ethan's jaw tightened. Moving to the corner, he peered around. A single guard stood by the door, huddled against the wind rifle, leaning against the wall while he tried to light a cigarette. Ethan moved like a shadow through the snow. The guard never saw him coming. A swift blow with his rifle butt dropped the man unconscious. They dragged him away from the door, and Lila quickly bound his hands and feet with rope they'd brought. Inside the shed, they found her Maria, barely more than a child, chained to the wall, face bruised, clothes torn. When she saw them, she cringed back, expecting more violence. "We're here to help," Lila said softly in Spanish. "Your brother Miguel sent us." Hope flickered in the girl's eyes. "Miguel is alive. Alive and safe. We're getting you out of here." Ethan broke the chains with bolt cutters they'd found in the shed. Maria could barely stand, weak from cold and abuse. As Lila wrapped her in the guard's coat, shouts erupted from the main building. Someone had discovered their presence. "Go," Ethan said, pushing them toward the door. "Get her to the trees. I'll hold them." "We go together, or not at all," Lila said firmly. Men poured from the main building, dark shapes against the snow. Ethan fired, dropping the first one, then the second. Return fire shattered the shed's windows, showering them with splinters. They retreated out the back, Lila half carrying Maria, while Ethan covered their escape. The storm that had hidden their approach now saved their lives. In the white chaos, the pursuers couldn't track them effectively. Gunfire cracked through the wind, but the shots were wild, blind. They ran, stumbled, fell, got up and ran again, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind them. Halfway back to the cabin, Maria collapsed completely. Ethan carried her the rest of the way, Lila leading, now finding their trail by pure instinct. When the cabin finally appeared through the snow, warm light glowing from its windows, it looked like salvation itself. Ben threw open the door as they staggered onto the porch. Inside, Miguel cried out at the sight of his sister trying to rise despite his wounds. They laid Maria on a pallet by the fire, and Lila immediately began examining her injuries while Ben's son Tom stood guard at the window. "They'll come," Ethan said, reloading his rifle. "Vincent Kellerman won't let this go." "Let them come," Ben said grimly. "This cabin's built solid, and we've got clear fields of fire." But as the night wore on, no attack came. The storm continued its fury, making travel nearly impossible. By dawn, it had finally begun to break, revealing a world transformed by white. Nearly 3 feet of snow had fallen, drifts reaching much higher against the cabin walls. It was Tom who spotted them first, riders approaching from the east, but not who they expected. Sheriff Watson led the group accompanied by federal marshals and a full posse. "Ethan Boone," Watson called out. "We're here to help." Warily, Ethan opened the door. Watson dismounted, wading through the snow with difficulty. "Got word from a guard who escaped the logging camp," Watson explained. "Said Vincent Kellerman was holding a girl prisoner planning to sell her. The marshals were already looking for him for killing their colleague." "You're too late for the rescue," Ethan said. "But Kellerman's men might still be at the camp." "Not anymore." A federal marshal joined them, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "We hit them at dawn. Vincent Kellerman is dead, tried to shoot it out rather than surrender. The rest are in custody." "It's over?" Lila asked, appearing in the doorway. "This part is," the marshal said. "Though there's still the matter of the Kellerman Empire. With Charles in prison and Vincent dead, their holdings are being seized. The territorial government wants to redistribute the land to families the Kellermans drove out." He turned to Ethan. "Mr. Boone, there's talk of appointing you as territorial deputy, helping keep peace in the mountains." "Interested?" Ethan looked back at Lila, who smiled and nodded. "I'll think about it," he said. After the lawmen left, taking statements and ensuring Maria and Miguel would be safely escorted home once they recovered, the cabin felt strangely quiet. Ben and Tom had departed with the posse, leaving Ethan and Lila alone again. "A territorial deputy," she mused, adding wood to the fire. "That's quite a change from exile. Don't know if I want it, being responsible for law and order, dealing with people's problems." "You're already doing that," she pointed out. "The difference is you'd be paid for it." They stood together at the window, watching the sun turn the snow-covered mountains into diamonds. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and new, full of possibility. "We never finished the addition," Ethan said. "We will. Come spring, we'll finish it properly." She leaned against him. "Maybe make it bigger. Room for a family." He looked down at her, seeing the future in her eyes. Children playing in the meadow gardens, green with growth. The cabin expanded into a proper home. It seemed impossible and inevitable all at once. "Lila, He struggled with words that had never come easy. "I love you. I should have said it before, but..." She silenced him with a kiss, then pulled back to look into his eyes. "I love you too. Have since you kissed me in that church, claiming me when no one else would stand for me." That wasn't exactly a kiss. More like marking territory. It was both, and it was perfect. She took his hand, placing it on her stomach. "Ethan, there's something else. I'm fairly certain, that is, I think I'm carrying our child." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her then, at where his hand rested, feeling the whole world shift and reorganize around this new reality. "A child," he said wonderingly. "Our child. Are you happy?" For answer, he swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the small cabin until they were both laughing and dizzy. When he set her down, his face was serious. "Marry me," he said, "properly, legally, in front of witnesses. I want everyone to know you're my wife, that our children are legitimate, that we're a family." "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." That evening, as they sat planning their future, the territorial deputy position, he'd probably accept the expansion of the cabin, the trip to town for a proper wedding, Miguel woke fully for the first time. His sister slept peacefully beside him, her hand clutched in his. "You saved her," he said to them. "You risked everything for strangers." "No one's a stranger who needs help," Lila said. "That's what makes us human instead of animals. We choose to help even when it costs us." "How do I repay such a debt?" "You don't," Ethan said. "You pass it on. Someday someone else will need help. You give it freely as we did." Miguel nodded solemnly. "This I swear." As night fell over the mountains, the cabin glowed with warmth and light. 4 souls had found sanctuary here, but more than that, they'd found humanity in its best form. Courage in the face of evil, compassion for the suffering, and the bonds that form when people choose to stand together rather than alone. Outside, an owl called its voice, carrying across the frozen landscape. But inside there was laughter and planning, and the quiet joy of lives intertwining. The cabin that had once been a hermit shelter was becoming what Ethan had never dared imagine: a home where love could grow, where children would be born, where the future stretched out not in lonely years, but in shared seasons of challenge and triumph. Spring would come as it always did, melting the snow and revealing the earth ready for planting. The addition would be completed, rooms added for the family they were creating. The territorial deputy badge would bring new responsibilities, but also new purpose. And through it all, the mountains would stand witness to the greatest miracle of all two broken souls who'd found wholeness in each other, creating something beautiful from the ashes of their past pain. But that was all to come. Tonight there was just this: the fire crackling, the storm past, and the quiet certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Ethan pulled Lila closer, his hand resting protective over where their child grew, and felt peace settle into his bones like snow covering the harsh edges of the world, making everything soft and new and full of promise. The story that had begun with a desperate auction and a forced kiss had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. Not just survival, not just love, but the creation of a legacy that would outlast them both. A family forged in hardship, but tempered by hope. Proof that even in the wildest mountains, the human heart could build something worth defending. As sleep took them, the last log in the fire collapsed in a shower of sparks, sending shadows dancing on the walls like spirits of the past, giving way to the bright possibilities of tomorrow. And somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, not lonely anymore, but calling to its pack, announcing that all was well in its territory, that the night held no terrors that togetherness couldn't overcome. The spring sun warmed the expanded cabin's porch, where Lila sat in the rocking chair Ethan had carved during the long winter months, their son Jacob nursing contentedly at her breast. The child had his father's dark hair, but her green eyes a combination that made Ethan's chest tight with emotion every time he looked at them together. From inside came the sound of hammering. Miguel and his sister, Maria, had returned to help with the latest addition, a proper kitchen with a cast-iron stove that had taken 6 men to haul up the mountain. "Deputy Boone," a voice called from the trail. Ethan looked up from the fence he was repairing to see a rider approaching young Tom Holloway, now serving as his unofficial assistant in keeping peace throughout the mountain territories. "What brings you up here, Tom?" "Got word from town. The railroad ceremony is next week. They're specifically requesting your presence, you and Mrs. Boone both. Governor's coming from Denver." Lila looked up from the baby, her expression skeptical. "They want to parade us around like some kind of frontier success story." "Probably," Ethan agreed, walking over to stand beside her chair. "We don't have to go." "Actually," Tom said, dismounting and pulling out an official-looking envelope, "you might want to. This came with the invitation." Ethan opened the letter, his eyebrows rising as he read. "It's from the Territorial Attorney General. They're offering me the position of Chief Deputy for the entire mountain region. Full authority, proper salary, and—" he paused, looking at Lila. "Funding to build a proper ranger station here, make this area an official outpost of law enforcement." "Here," Lila asked. "On our land, adjacent to it. They want to establish a permanent presence in these mountains, and they figure we're already here, already doing the work." He handed her the letter. "It's a real position, Lila. Not just informal peacekeeping, but actual authority to make a difference." She read through it carefully while Jacob finished nursing her free hand, absently stroking the baby's downy hair. It would mean more people coming through, more danger potentially. Also more help when we need it, and a school eventually. Says here they'd fund a teacher if we could guarantee at least 6 students. Maria had come out onto the porch, drawn by the conversation. At 16, she'd blossomed in the years since her rescue, the trauma fading, though never forgotten. She'd taken to helping Lila with the baby and the garden, finding peace in the simple routines of mountain life. "A school?" she asked eagerly. "A real school." "Would you want to attend?" Lila asked, smiling at the girl's enthusiasm. "I want to be the teacher," Maria said firmly. "Miguel taught me to read and write in Spanish and English both. I could teach the little ones while I learn more myself." Ethan and Lila exchanged glances. In the past year, 3 other families had established homesteads within a day's ride of their cabin, drawn by the promise of protection and fair dealing that Ethan's presence provided. The Garrett family had 4 children. The Stones had 2, and just last month the Washingtons had arrived from Kansas with 3 young ones. More than enough for a school. "We'll go to the ceremony," Ethan decided. Accept the position properly, but on our terms. The trip down to Cedar Falls a week later was vastly different from any of their previous descents. They rode in a proper wagon, now Jacob secure in a basket beside Lila Miguel driving while Maria rode alongside on her own horse. The trail had been improved over the winter, widened and graded to accommodate increasing traffic to the mountain settlements. The town itself had transformed. The railroad had brought prosperity and problems in equal measure. New buildings lined the streets, including a proper hotel, a newspaper office, and even a small theater. But there were also saloons, gambling halls, and the kind of transient troublemakers that followed railroad construction. They were met at the town limits by Sheriff Watson and a delegation of citizens including Mrs. Patterson and Doc Marcus. The old woman embraced Lila carefully, mindful of the baby. "Look at you," she said, tears in her eyes. "A proper family. Tom would be so proud." The ceremony itself was held at the new railroad depot, a grand building of red brick and iron that seemed impossibly modern against the frontier backdrop. Governor Evans gave a speech about progress and civilization, about how the railroad would bring prosperity to all. But when he called Ethan forward to officially accept his position, it was Lila who stole the show. She stood beside her husband Jacob in her arms, and when the governor finished his prepared remarks about law and order, she spoke up. "Progress isn't just about rails and commerce," she said, her clear voice carrying across the crowd. "It's about justice for all people, protection for the vulnerable, and opportunity for those who've been forgotten. My husband has accepted this position not to serve the railroad or the wealthy, but to ensure that every family in these mountains, settler or native, rich or poor, receives equal protection under the law." The crowd murmured, some approvingly, others less so. But Governor Evans, a shrewd politician, recognized the moment's importance. "Well said, Mrs. Boone. The territory is fortunate to have both of you in its service." After the ceremony, they were approached by numerous people. Some wanted favors, others offered bribes disguised as gifts. Still others simply wanted to associate themselves with the new power structure. Ethan handled them all with gruff efficiency, while Lila provided the diplomatic touch, accepting what would help their mountain community and politely refusing what wouldn't. But the most significant encounter came as they were preparing to leave. A well-dressed woman approached, elderly, but still elegant, with eyes that seemed familiar. "Mr. Boone," she said, "you probably don't remember me. I'm Sarah Kellerman, Charles's widow." Ethan tensed his hand, moving instinctively toward his weapon, but the woman raised her hand peacefully. "I'm not here for revenge. I've come to apologize." She looked at them both with eyes full of regret. "I knew what Charles was. I knew what he did to you, to Samuel, to so many others. I stayed silent out of fear and comfort, and that silence made me complicit." "Mrs. Kellerman," Lila began, but the older woman shook her head. "Please let me finish. I've liquidated what remains of the Kellerman holdings. Most will go to families Charles destroyed, but I wanted to give this to you specifically." She handed Ethan a leather folder. "It's the deed to Eagles Peak and the surrounding 1,000 acres. Charles stole it from the original homesteader 20 years ago. I'm returning it to someone who'll use it properly." Ethan opened the folder, staring at the deed. Eagles Peak was prime land with water rights and timber worth a fortune. "I can't accept this," he said. "You can and you will," Sarah Kellerman said firmly. "Consider it partial payment for 10 years of stolen life. Besides, I hear you're planning to help establish a proper community in the mountains. You'll need the resources." She turned to leave, then paused. "My grandson Vincent was a monster Mr. Boone raised in his father's image. You did the world a service stopping him. I won't mourn what he became, only what he might have been in a different family." As she walked away, Lila touched Ethan's arm. 1,000 acres. We could help so many families establish themselves. We could build that school Maria wants. Maybe even a small clinic for when Doc Marcus can't make it up the mountain. They left Cedar Falls that afternoon, the wagon loaded with supplies and plans for the future. As they climbed back into the mountains, Jacob woke from his nap, gurgling happily at the sky passing overhead. Maria sang a Spanish lullaby, while Miguel pointed out landmarks to some newcomers they'd agreed to guide to available homestead land. "It's really happening," Lila said wonderingly. "We're building a community." "We're building more than that," Ethan replied, guiding the horses around a familiar bend. We're building a future where our son can grow up free, where families like Miguel and Maria's can't be destroyed by powerful men's whims, where justice means something more than who has the most money. As they crested the final ridge, their cabin came into view, but it was no longer alone. Smoke rose from chimneys of 3 other homesteads visible in the distance. They could hear the ring of axes where the Garrett boys were clearing land for spring planting and see Mrs. Stone hanging laundry while her children played in the yard. "Look," Maria pointed excitedly. "Mr. Holloway's already started on the school foundation." Indeed, Ben and Tom Holloway were there with several other men marking out where the new building would stand. When they saw the wagon approaching, a cheer went up. "Deputy Boone, Ben called out. "Hope you don't mind, but we figured we'd get started. Want to have it roofed before the summer storms." As Ethan helped Lila down from the wagon, Jacob secure in her arms, he looked around at the activity, the life that had sprouted in what had been his solitary exile. The man who'd once lived as a hermit nursing wounds and grievances had become the center of a growing community. That evening, they held a celebration dinner outside tables made from planks and sawhorses laden with food everyone had contributed. Stories were shared, plans discussed, children ran between the adults' legs while babies slept in their mother's arms. As the sun set behind the peaks painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Ethan stood to speak. "A year ago, Lila and I came back to these mountains looking for shelter from a world that had turned cruel. We found more than shelter, we found purpose. Each of you has made that same journey in your own way, choosing the hard path of frontier life over the false comforts of town living." He raised his cup of coffee. They'd all agreed to keep alcohol out of their settlement. "To the future we're building together. To the children who'll grow up free in these mountains. To the community that looks out for its own. And to the families we're creating and protecting." The toast was echoed enthusiastically, but it was little Tom Stone, all of 5 years old, who provided the evening's most memorable moment. "Mr. Ethan," he piped up, "my pa says you used to be an outlaw. Is that true?" A hush fell over the gathering. Ethan looked at the boy, then at his own son sleeping in Lila's arms. "I was an exile," he said carefully, "sent away for something that wasn't my fault. But you know what? That exile taught me something important. Sometimes being pushed out of society shows you what really matters. Not money or position or even comfort, but people who stand by you, who fight beside you, who help you become better than you were." He looked around at the assembled faces, weathered, hopeful, determined. "Every person here has been an outlaw in some way. Mrs. Garrett, you defied your rich family to marry for love. Miguel and Maria fled a system that would have destroyed them. The Washingtons left everything behind because they refused to live under unjust laws. Even Mrs. Lila here broke the law when she ran from a forced marriage." "So we're all outlaws?" young Tom asked wide-eyed. "We're all people who chose freedom over conformity," Lila said, shifting Jacob to her other arm. "Who decided that living true to ourselves mattered more than living comfortable lives. That's why we'll succeed here," Ben Holloway added. "We've all got too much invested in this freedom to let it fail." As the evening wound down and families began heading to their homes, Ethan and Lila stood on their porch watching lanterns bob through the darkness like fireflies. Jacob had woken cooing at the stars beginning to emerge overhead. "No regrets?" Ethan asked, wrapping his arm around his wife. "How could I regret this?" She gestured at the scene before them, the quiet industry of a community preparing for night. The peaceful mountains standing guard the promise of tomorrow's work and growth. "A year ago, I was being sold to pay a false debt. Now I'm helping build something that will outlast us all. The railroad folks want me to focus on keeping their interests protected," Ethan said, "making sure the timber contracts favor them, that the water rights flow their way. And will you? I'll keep the peace, I'll enforce the law, but the law is going to work for everyone, not just the wealthy. They may come to regret giving me this authority." Lila laughed, the sound carrying across the clearing. "They definitely will. You're not the tame lawman they think they've hired. And you're not the proper lawman's wife they expect either. Good. Let's keep surprising them." As they went inside, Ethan paused at the threshold, looking back one more time. The scared, angry man who'd built this cabin as a fortress against the world could never have imagined this community family purpose beyond mere survival. The mountains hadn't changed, but everything else had. "Coming to bed?" Lila asked from inside, and he could hear her settling Jacob into his cradle. In a moment. He stood there breathing in the night air that carried the smell of pine and wood smoke and the promise of rain. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, disputes to settle newcomers to evaluate probably trouble from the railroad camp. But tonight there was peace. A wolf howled in the distance, answered by another, then another, a pack calling to each other across the vast wilderness. But for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't hear loneliness in their cries. He heard family connection, the bonds that made survival possible in a harsh world. "Ethan," Lila called softly. He went inside, barring the door behind him, but knowing that what they were protecting now was so much more than just themselves. They were guarding a dream made manifest, a place where exiles could find home, where the broken could heal, where love could flourish, despite the rocky soil and harsh seasons. As he joined his wife in their bed, their son sleeping peacefully nearby, Ethan Boone finally understood what he'd been searching for through all those years of exile and violence. Not just survival or even love, but something larger, the chance to build a legacy of justice and compassion in a world that often lacked both. The cabin creaked softly in the night wind, its walls expanded, but its soul unchanged. It remained a shelter, but now it sheltered more than just two people. It sheltered hope itself, and in the harsh mountains of the frontier, hope was the most precious commodity of all. Tomorrow would come with its duties and challenges. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. The family sleeping safe, the community growing strong, and the future stretching ahead like an unbroken trail ready for their footsteps to mark the way.